right, everybody. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. I really appreciate your time and your energy. This subject is very near and dear to my heart, but first I should introduce myself. Sha'e Dene Bex Yanashia, Nanishtaja Tachini Nishlam, Maideshki Bashchi, Skodachini Dashache, Kia Ani Dashanella. I am originally from Chinle, Arizona, which is on the Navajo Nation. And I am a registered dietitian. So can we get a raise of hands? Who are all the dietitians here? Yes, my people. Who are the nurses here? Just to get a better idea. Okay, so we got a few nurses. I heard there were some from IHS as well. So thank you for coming all this way. I know it's quite a drive, but I really appreciate you coming. So today, so you'll be with me 5 sessions. So we are doing 3 sessions hosted by me, plus we have a few other presentations today from other people. And then tomorrow we'll be doing 2. So this is 1 of 5 that I'll be talking. All right, so today's topic, or this morning's topic, the first topic is called Nourishing Health, Essential Nutrition Insights for Healthcare Providers. So this was tailored a little bit to focus in on maybe if there's people who don't have that nutrition background, just to get us all on the same level about where we're coming from. I did want to put a disclaimer out there as well, since this is being offered, or we are offering CEUs for this. Disclaimers are usually a generally good idea. I am a paid consultant for Bitty Baby Foods and Good Food Collective. And then another disclaimer is I can only speak from my own perspective of my lived experiences as both a Navajo woman and a registered dietitian who used to work on the res. And then take what's helpful, leave what's not. You know, we all have different experiences. We come at health and nutrition differently. And I want to honor that. And so take what's helpful, leave what's not. I like to say that to my own patients. You know, if something resonates with you, great. If not, then maybe we can find another way to accomplish things. I am standing too close to the edge. All right. Okay, so just some objectives for this presentation. We're going to go over macro and micronutrients, just some terminology, basic nutrition terminology, specifically native foods that can offer those nutrients. We're going to go over nutrition across the life stages, just some things to keep in mind. Dietitians, you know, pretty used to it, but for the rest of us folks, you know, what are we looking at when we're focusing on different populations? And then also just a little bit about leadership and counseling strategies for Native communities. We are going to really dig into counseling techniques tomorrow at tomorrow's presentation, the nutrition, education, behavior techniques. So that's where we'll really dig into it. If this one was just kind of like a brief overview, don't worry, we'll get more into it. And then also just when to refer. So there are dietitians here. And so I think it's helpful for non-dietitian providers to know when to refer to nutrition specialists such as dietitians. All right, first, I will tell you, with every one of my presentations, we will need your phone and I will need my phone. So let me grab it. So go ahead and scan this QR code. I built in several multiple choice questions throughout all of my presentations. So the question here is, how comfortable do you feel providing nutrition information or guidance to your patients? And so if you don't know how to scan a QR code, just pull up the phone app, or the photo app on your phone, direct it towards that, and then a link should automatically pop up. All right, so answers are A, very comfortable. I frequently discuss nutrition, feel confident in my knowledge. B, somewhat comfortable. I provide basic advice, but prefer to refer to a dietitian for in-depth support. C, not very comfortable. I mention nutrition, but don't feel confident answering detailed questions. And then D, not comfortable at all. I avoid giving nutrition advice. And for those on Zoom, you can do the same thing. So all of this, we're aggregating all of our data here. All right, so I'm going to answer since I can't see the answers. So we have 31 people so far, 33. How many have registered for this event, Marnie? Okay. So let's try to get half of that. Cross our fingers that half of us are here. All right, so we got like 42. Let's see if we can get it up to 50, y'all, and especially on Zoom. Maybe not. 44. Got 6 more. 48. We're almost there, you guys. Let's get to 50. Otherwise, I'm going to sit here all day and then you won't get to see the rest of the presentations. All right, we got 50. Yes. Okay. So it sounds like a lot of people are very comfortable. I frequently discuss nutrition and feel confident in my knowledge. That's so amazing. I'm so proud of you. So hopefully we'll add some extra things to your toolbox as people who practice in the nutrition field. There's always something new, right? It's an evolving science. And there's always something new to learn. There's new terminology. So hopefully today we'll give you some extra information. And so runner-up was be somewhat comfortable. I provide basic advice. All right, cool. Okay, moving on. So like I said, nutrition's a science. We, as dietitians, we hear that a lot. Nutrition's evolving. And sometimes that can cause frustration for our communities. For instance, eggs, a lot when I used to counsel, people would come in and be like, why can't I have eggs? Or, I throw away the yolk and I just eat the egg whites. And the evidence has changed on that, right? We now know that, our cholesterol intake doesn't really affect our internal cholesterol levels. And so it's a little bit confusing. And so as dietitians, we're kind of here to interpret some of that evidence and some of that advice and be like, okay, maybe 30 years ago, that was the case, or we thought that was the case. We looked into it a little bit more, and now we're recommending something else. And so with, there's the, basic evidence nutrition stuff that we all learn as dietitians. However, when I became a dietitian, it was really hard to find interventions that in the evidence that was effective for my community. And so sometimes I say, objective perspective is required. Yeah, we can look at the evidence. However, it's a little different when we practice nutrition education in Native communities because there just isn't much evidence. I can't say if this intervention works or not. There's like little snippets here and there. And there is reason why there's not a lot of research out there regarding nutrition education interventions in Native communities. As a whole, Native communities are hesitant to have research done in the communities for very valid reasons. We won't get into that today, but just be mindful, that's where I come in and say like, yeah, we can talk about evidence-based diets, evidence-based recommendations. However, Native communities, a lot of it is just kind of like based on, this is what worked for my patients. And I've counseled at least 1,000 Navajo patients. I used to work in the hospital. I used to do group education. I still do group education. And so maybe it could be more than 2,000 by this point, because I've done, I don't know how many cooking classes and like education sessions in the last 3 years. So that's just something to keep in mind as we're thinking about nutrition evidence. I do want to highlight some terms that I might be flip-flopping back and forth. So this conference is called, indigenous food, right? And so sometimes for me and for many other Native people, we flip-flop between terminology, indigenous, Native, Navajo, Diné, tribal names in our own language. So just know I may flip-flop back in there, back and forth. Many different Native communities have their own, or Native people, individual people have their own preferences. And so my preference is just kind of all of them. I'm like an equal opportunity with all those terms. So just be aware that, some of your indigenous clients, Native clients may have different preferences for their, in the way they self-identify. And so when it comes to defining terms, I do want to highlight these two terms, indigenous food versus cultural food. So what I like to how I like to define it is indigenous food is harvested from the land. It's harvested from plant and animal resources. It can be local, seasonal, and nutritious and environmentally friendly. So that's like, some of the ingredients that we're cooking with tomorrow, like juniper ash. Juniper ash is gonna be, local, seasonal. You can't buy juniper ash like out in Chicago, right? You have to kind of know somebody or know which trading post to go to or find a family member who can produce it. That's something like indigenous food. So cultural food is a little bit different because cultural food has been impacted by colonization, globalization, westernization, and it's cross-cultural and it's fusion. So that's something that can also represent current access. So many of our Native communities are food insecure. There's some evidence that says up to 75% of Natives report some level of food insecurity. And so that means that many of our foods are also going to be budget friendly, because you're not buying chia seeds out at Whole Foods. You're looking for, a little bit more economical food. So that's what I like to call cultural foods. So just an example, I said indigenous food was like juniper ash. Spam would be like a cultural food. We're not going out into the forest and getting spam off the trees, right? But it is something that is near and dear to many Native communities. So I do want to hold those, hold places for those too. I'm a dietitian where I'm more of a um, meet people where they're at dietitian. I like to think of things, I like to think of my education, nutrition education, in terms of what can we add in, and you'll get that theme over the next few presentations in the next few days. That's where kind of my approach to nutrition is. So I do want to also highlight, indigenous foods and cultural foods. They offer different types of nourishment, right? For when I went to school, a lot of, the focus was this has how many milligrams of vitamin C, this has how many grams of protein or carbohydrates, which is important. That's why I became a dietitian, because I wanted to talk about that and I wanted to talk about balance. So in terms of food, indigenous foods, yeah, they provide us physical nourishment in terms of energy, helps us feel stronger, helps provide micronutrients, and it helps prevent disease and illness. So like high fiber indigenous foods like blue cornmeal, those are higher in fiber. But I also like to bring up the topic of emotional nourishment. So for me, I feel like physical nourishment, when we talk about physical nourishment of foods, that's only half the story. And we need to fill in the other half and think about emotional nourishment. And for so long, many of our communities have been told, don't eat your indigenous food, don't eat the blue corn mush, don't eat the corn, don't eat the beans, which is crazy. It sounds crazy now, but we were told that. I was told that growing up. I grew up in the Indian Health Service system. I'm from Chinle. I grew up on the res. Many of the healthcare providers told us to stop eating our native foods. And so we're kind of at a turning point now where it's like, wait a minute, these foods are valid. These foods do provide us with that cultural pride. And it's not a good idea to shame whole communities when we don't know a lot about, our foods. And so I do want to honor some of that emotional nourishment piece, where it's an expression of a person's identity. It's an expression of their pride. It's an expression of their confidence. And it's also a symbol of resilience. So I do want to hold space for that. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty. Let me see if I'm on time. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about basic nutrition terminology and then just some native foods that help fill in those gaps. So carbohydrates, we'll go over the first three macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, fat. Carbohydrates, they can be divided into simple versus complex. So simple would be the ones that you can taste on your tongue. Our tongues are specifically made to pick up those sweeter foods because that's the source of energy. So as Native communities, when we're out, doing stuff, out living life back in the day, when we would taste something, we would pick up on the sweetness and we would say like, oh, that's, we get energy from this. And so some local or some indigenous foods, not local, but indigenous foods across the nation would include things like maybe agave syrup, honey, or maple syrup. And the other one would be like, um, if you're Navajo and you know that pink flower, the honeysuckle flower, right? What do you call it in Navajo? You know? Anyway, there's a flower out there that you can suck on it and you can taste the nectar and you can bring it out. And so it's like that's energy too. Didn't include a picture of that. So those, the sciencey term is called monosaccharides or disaccharides, meaning it's two glucose molecules or six carbon atom molecule that triggers that sweetness taste in our tongue. And that's how we can get it. So complex carbs, are going to be things like corn tortillas, potatoes, corn, blue Hubbard squash, blue cornmeal, and wild rice. And so those are more of the foods that our body is going to break it down into blood sugar or glucose. But it doesn't taste sweet in our tongue unless we like hold it in our mouth for a while, right? So if you hold, I don't know, maybe blue corn mush and mouth in your mouth for a little while, you'll start to pick up on the sweetness because of the salivary amylase present in your mouth. And now fruits, so things like peaches. Peaches are gonna, be more, peaches, apricots, plums are gonna be a little bit more indigenous and local around here. I like to say that's kind of in the middle, because it does have, some of those complex carbs, but because some of them are sweet, they're going to have a mix of those simple carbs. So other types of indigenous foods would also fall into this category, other fruits too. So that's how we define those two. So just some myths and facts about carbohydrates. I know carbs are blamed for a lot of different things in nutrition, but it's always about balance, right? We always want to focus on providing balanced nutrition to our patients. So sometimes, when I get patients asking me about carbs, these are the common themes that people ask about. They think carbs are bad for you, where in fact, carbs give us energy, and our goal is to collect or to eat, foods that have complex carbohydrates. And so then that way we have that long lasting energy, those higher fiber carbs. And then again, people think all carbs are the same. I often hear from my native patients, they say, uh, carbs are sugar. And then that's how they break it down. And then they think sugar is bad for you. So therefore, don't eat carbs. And that's pretty common. That's not, something unique to native patients. It's all over the area. People think that. But carbs aren't sugar. Carbs aren't all monosaccharides or disaccharides. They are different types of carbs, and it's okay to have that balance. So not all carbs are equal. We want to focus on more of those complex carbs. And then again, people think fruit have too much sugar, quote unquote sugar, and they should be avoided. And so the way I like to tell people is like, it's added sugar that as dietitians we're concerned about. We're not adding sugar to our peach. If we're going to have a peach for a snack, we're not adding sugar on top of it to make it sweet. Maybe we are. There are some people who do like canned peaches and they put sugar on top. That's actually like an older elder nutrition, native nutrition snack. But for the most part, like, we don't need that extra, or we don't need to add that extra sugar on top of it. But again, added sugar, depending on which professional organization you're talking about, it can go up to the recommendation for like limits. If you want to add limits, is like 40 to 50 grams, depending on which professional organization you're looking at. And so that also tells us like, hey, it's fine to have a little bit of sugar too. That's fine. But what we're looking at is the added sugar that's, that might be the issue. If somebody has diabetes, we're looking at the added sugar. Please eat your fruit if you still have diabetes. Please, I'm begging you. So, fruit also has lots of antioxidants. It has lots of fiber. And so why should we discourage our patients from eating that? If somebody has a wound, they need that vitamin C. They need those antioxidants for the wound healing capacity from the fruit. And for the most part, like unless you're eating bell peppers, that's kind of fruit has generally has more vitamin C than like other types of vegetables. So, just things to think about. And again, it depends on the person's condition. So, and as far as protein goes, some native forms of protein. I did include some non-local indigenous foods in here too. So these are things, so there's two types of proteins, animal-based and plant-based. Um, and again, for me, I'm like, balance, let's try to mix in a little bit of both. We don't have to go all plant-based. We don't have to all go like carnivore. So, animal base is going to have a higher biological value, meaning our body is able to break it down a little bit better and absorb those nutrients a little bit better. It does have like it is a complete protein, which means it has the 9 essential amino acids. And for the most part, like the nutrients that you can get from animal-based proteins would be like zinc, iron, calcium, B12, some types of omega-3, depending on like the source. And then saturated fats. So those are the types of nutrients that you get from that. So things like seafood, obviously we're not near a sea. That's for indigenous foods on the coasts. Fish, salmon, rabbit, bison, sheep for us Navajos, got to throw that in. Prairie dogs, Navajos used to eat prairie dogs. I want to start like a campaign, like bring prairie dogs back. Like, and then turkey. Turkey is another indigenous food. Plant-based, it's going to have a lower biological value, meaning it takes a little bit more time for a body to break it apart and absorb those nutrients. Usually incomplete, asterisk, meaning there are certain type of plant-based proteins that do have the 9 essential amino acids. Dietitians, who wants to throw that out there? What are I'd say like 2 or 3 plant-based proteins. Soy, what else? Not beans. That one's missing lysine, I think. Quinoa. Yeah, so those are actually, quinoa is an indigenous food. It's indigenous to Peru area, but obviously soy is from, East Asian countries. So yeah, so that's what I mean is like there are 2 plant-based proteins that we can get those complete proteins from. So other things like beans, nuts, pumpkin seeds, those are also plant-based proteins as well. So just some myths and facts about proteins. So some people think you need to eat a lot of protein to be healthy. If you follow me on Instagram, I've had a whole campaign about this. But that's not quite true. For the most part, the RDA for males and females in the US is like around 50 grams per day. That's just to prevent protein calorie malnutrition. But it can be higher depending on your goals, depending on your conditions. So we don't need to have 1 gram per kilogram or 1 gram or 1.5 grams per kilogram for everybody. That's kind of like the social media influencers are saying that, and they got a hold of like some dietitians speak, and I'm like, ah. So it is important. It's important for repair, and especially for somebody who has liver disease or they're on dialysis. We do want to pump up that protein. But, again, everybody's individual. So that's where we have to say, not everybody needs to have a ton of protein. Let's look at fiber. Other thing is you can only get enough protein from meat. Like I said, there's 2 different types of proteins. It's okay to have both. Totally fine. I know, some people are really focused on eating more plant-based, which is great. However, just think, many native or indigenous communities, hunting and butchering and slaughtering is part of their cultural traditions. It's part of some ceremonies as well. And so we want to be mindful of that as well. Like if we say, don't ever eat sheep again, but for us Navajos, sheep is life, it's giving the wrong vibes. And so again, sometimes people think the more protein you eat, the more muscle you build. Let me switch sides. I feel like I need to switch sides now, get some walking in. So the more protein you eat, the more muscle you build. But in reality, muscle just doesn't come out of thin air. If you eat more protein, we do actually need to train the muscles in conjunction with eating slightly more protein. It's not just like eat more and then I'm buff. I'm all built. All right. So last macronutrient, which is fats. Again, two different categories, unsaturated versus saturated. Unsaturated, that's going to have like those, the reason why it's called unsaturated is because it's not saturated fully to the max with hydrogen atoms. And so because of that, because it's not fully saturated, it kind of like kinks a little, like the whole molecule kinks, and that's why it's more liquidy. So I kind of like to think of it like spaghetti noodles. Spaghetti noodles, when you get it wet, it starts to kind of like kink, and then if you put it in a big old pile, it's like really flowy. That's kind of how unsaturated fat is. It contains those double bonds. And those are going to be things like olive oil, all not indigenous, and canola oil as well, not really indigenous, but we do have other indigenous foods like sunflower seeds, nuts, avocados, which is indigenous to South America, and then pumpkin seeds, pine nuts, piñons are going to have more of those unsaturated fats. Saturated, again, we're thinking about that spaghetti noodle where it's like stacked like a brick when it's dry, right? That's how I like to think of saturated fats, is if it's dry, it's going to be a big old brick and it's going to be solid at room temperature. And that means that it's fully saturated with hydrogen atoms, meaning that there's as much hydrogen we could pack onto it, solid at room temp. So those are things like coconut oil, little sort of indigenous to like, some of the Caribbean islands. We have bison, which is going to be saturated. Sheep is saturated. And who can guess what that is up there? A cheat. So, well, how do you make a cheat? How do you make it? So tell us. Yeah. So yeah. So when we butcher a sheep, there's like visceral fat that covers the organs. And so what we do as Navajos, we roll up the visceral fat and we clean out the intestines, the small intestine, pretty well. My aunt was like, "Oh, leave it a little dirty. We want the taste." And I'm like, "Oh, gross," because we know what goes through the small intestines, right? That's the poop. And so my aunt's like, "Just leave a little bit in there." And I'm like, "No, I'm cleaning this." So we wrap the small intestine around a piece of visceral fat. And so that's obviously saturated fat. So yeah, a little bit of myths and facts about fats. People say all fats are bad for you. That was very much in vogue in the 90s, where everybody was like low fat, low fat, low fat. But we've again evolved as a science, and we've learned maybe not to try to achieve ultimate low fat status for all of our foods, because we still need fats to absorb certain nutrients. They're beneficial in different ways. Our cells use them in that phospholipid bilayer for all of our cells in our body. And again, people think that, low fat is the ultimate goal. But we do want to, still have a place for that. It also does offer some of that satiety. It delays gastric emptying, and provides a little bit of taste. That's probably why we wrapped small intestines over each eat, because it tasted good. And then also the next myth is like coconut oil is the healthiest oil. This used to be really in vogue, like in the zeros or the tens. Everybody was putting coconut oil like on their skin, in their hair, on their feet. They were using it for like ear infections. I don't know what else they did with it, where else they put it. um, Now, like in the last year or two, won't name names, but somebody's been really into beef tallow as the other saturated fat that's in vogue. But again, you know, we want to, again, all things in moderation. We want to have that balance. Yes, we can have, there's room to have saturated fats. But for the most part, when we're advising patients or clients, we want to focus on some of those or the unsaturated fats in oversaturated fats, because for the most part, people aren't getting enough of those unsaturated fats, especially things like omega-3s. And piñons are really great for that too. So now let's get into just vitamins. You know, again, two different categories of vitamins. There's water soluble versus fat soluble. So the water soluble is going to be ones where you can easily mix it into water. Those are usually the ones, like if you buy multivitamins from the store, most of those pills are going to be water soluble. Just because if you're getting like it's hard to like kind of mix fat soluble. It can be done, but it's again, it's a little bit more expensive. So water soluble is going to be all of the B vitamins, thiamine, pyridoxine, cyanocobalamin, biotin, B12. B12 is cyanocobalamin, but those are going to be those B vitamins. And we get it from all different sorts of fruits and vegetables specifically. And so that's why, again, we don't want to tell our patients don't eat fruits, because that's where we're getting the water soluble vitamins. And again, fat soluble is going to be the A, D, E, and K. And I will say it is a little bit harder to get these ones, especially vitamin D for native patients. Many of my patients were usually vitamin D deficient. They had, you know, pretty low levels, like in the teens. And, you know, there is some research that says people who do have darker skin are going to be a little bit more vitamin D deficient, because we get vitamin D from sun exposure. And many people too in native communities are very modest dressers. So sometimes we're going to be using longer sleeves, or going to be more covered up. And so that also prevents us from vitamin D, having that vitamin D synthesis. So sometimes, you know, it is beneficial to do some supplementation for some of these, just depending on people's levels. But it is only soluble in fat. And so that's when I say, like, you know, sometimes when people say, oh, I don't put any dressing on my salad, and their salad has like carrots and red bell peppers and all these really colorful vegetables, and vegetables that have some of these fat soluble vitamins, I'm like, oh man, put a little bit of dressing on there just so you can get some of that nutrition, extra nutrition in you. Because if there's no lipids or fat present, it's harder for your body to absorb it, and then you end up passing it. So I don't want to get too much into like the macro minerals and the trace minerals, but this is just, you know, an overview. If you want to relook at the recording again about all the different minerals that we have out there, calcium, chloride, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, those are all really great nutrients. And again, we want to be encouraging patients to have a wide variety of foods, because that's how we're going to capture the most nutrients. Same with trace minerals. These ones are the ones that don't really get a lot of talk about, but we still need it in very, very small amounts. Things like chromium, copper, fluoride, iodine, iron, manganese, I don't know how to say that, molybdenum, which nobody talks about, but it's out there and we do need it, selenium, and zinc. Show of hands, who's heard of molybdenum before? Okay, who hasn't heard of molybdenum before? Okay, I'm like, oh yeah, there's that nutrient, right? Like it's just the random person coming out of there. I do want to go over nutrition recommendations for this, just because it's always always on my mind. And I like to talk a little bit about history too. And again, when patients come to us, they're very confused about what they perceive as conflicting nutrition information. And it's probably also due to the fact that our communication methods have changed over the last 50 years. Nutrition is a very new science. It's only been around since like 150 years-ish. I think Florence Nightingale was the one that kind of started understanding food was, can affect the outcome of people of soldiers who have been injured in war. So there's the nursing connection. And so for the US, this is specifically for the US, we have had a change over the decades in how we recommend. And for the most part, those recommendations were based on Eurocentric approaches and foods that are more commonly seen in European descended foods. And so it starts kind of with the 1940s, and a lot of the nutrition is just based on out of like war. And so we had the Guide to Eating. It's called the Basic Seven. They found that people who were being recruited into the war effort were malnourished. And they're like, hey, let's try to increase the nutrition so we have more healthy people coming into service. And then 1956 to the 70s, they called it the Food for Fitness, the Daily Guide. They called it the Basic Four. That's where we start to see a little bit more, groupings. 1979, they called it the Hassle-Free Daily Guide. I don't know if it looks very hassle-free, but that's what they called it. 1984, they had the Food Wheel. And then in 1992, they transitioned to the Food Guide Pyramid. And like how many influencers out there always bring up the Food Guide Pyramid, and it's like, that was from the 90s. Please, let's just let it go. And, for good reason, they probably grew up with the Food Guide Pyramid, and that was the last thing they heard about nutrition recommendations from the US government because they're not in the field. They don't understand that these recommendations change over time. And then now we transition to 2011, which is called My Plate. So My Plate did, have a little bit of a cosmetic change too. In 2020, the graphics were just updated a little bit more, but they found that making it a little bit more like the application of it a little bit more relatable, meaning making it look like a plate instead of like a pyramid. I think for a while there, I didn't include that one pyramid with the guy with the steps and the guy going up. I didn't include that because I was like, I don't want to like get really into it, but that one was out there. But the 2020 is the one that we use now. And so the key messages for your patients, what we're going towards is try to make half your plate fruits and vegetables. Yes, even for people with diabetes. Try to focus on whole fruits. Try to make half your plate or half your grains whole and a quarter of it whole. And so for Native communities, we want to identify which whole grains are indigenous. It's going to be wild rice and blue corn and corn. Those are three. There's other whole foods out there or indigenous foods out there that would qualify as like a whole grain. It just depends on the community. And then also vary your protein routine, again, looking at the plant-based and then animal-based. And that's something like when I teach cooking classes, I have this one recipe called the rainbow chili something, and it has like a mix of beans and ground beef. And I like to bring that up as like, look, they can coexist. We can have plant-based proteins, we can have animal-based proteins, and we get, extra nutrition from it. Now, the special thing about My Plate is when it comes to dairy, and especially when it comes to nutrition recommendations in Native communities, 80% of Native communities are lactose intolerant. So I don't go out there and say, go drink more milk, because that is going to give everybody a tummy ache. And I don't want to be around people who are drinking milk. And so just to save my nose. And so we can look at, milk alternatives, dairy alternatives, soy milk if you want to keep that, protein, intake a little bit more intact. Almond milk is fancy. There's like hemp milk, cashew milk, and all these crazy milks out there. So that's where I would recommend that. And then also people do a little bit better with like cheeses, hard cheeses, yogurts, especially Greek yogurt. It's a little bit better on the tummy. But a lot of many native communities actually resonate pretty well with cottage cheese. Like they just, when I mention fruit cocktail, they're like, cottage cheese, where's the cottage cheese? So that's another way of, getting in some of that dairy. Now, as far as like if cottage cheese does well with people, I don't know. I mean, a little bit better, but some of that lactose is still left in there. Um, unless it's like they have like fermented cottage cheese now, which I've seen, I've tasted it. It's pretty tasty, but it's a lot expensive and you would not find that on a reservation. So now we have My Plate, which is like for the general nutrition recommendations from the DGA, Dietary Guidelines for Americans. But for Native communities, we have something also that was developed by the Indian Health Service called My Native Plate. How many of you guys have seen this before? Raise your hands. Okay, so for the most of us have seen this. When it came out, it was pretty cool to see. Like there was some trying to adapt to our communities. And so we're thinking, okay, how do we add more indigenous foods? Again, the same recommendations apply. Make half your plate fruits and vegetables, quarter protein, quarter whole grains, and then have some kind of drink on the side. For Native communities, again, they're not saying go drink milk. They're saying drink water. And again, if we're having that varied diet, we're still going to get nutrients that are, historically associated with milk, like what is it, calcium? And we can, for Native communities, if we have a varied diet, we can get calcium in other ways, especially if you eat seafood, like with the bones, juniper ash, those are going to have higher calcium levels. So yeah, this is the plate, half your plate veggies. This one is like, seems to focus more on non-starchy veggies, wild rice, and then some kind of like, I think that one was bison, and then some like berries on the side. So again, I do want to pinpoint as a dietitian, nutrition, physical nutrition's just half the story for Native communities. And for food, thinking about how food is more than nutrients. Food is stories, food is storytelling, food is community, food is connection, food is resilience, food is life. So food can be a number of different things. And for like this picture, this is a Indian taco. And often, people want to be like, no tacos whatsoever. And, just kind of understanding and coming to a point thinking like, for a long time, we've been told to stop eating our foods. And if we keep perpetuating that harm, how is that going to empower people? So again, understanding one food does not make or break our health. Okay. And we can have balance throughout the day. If we're going to go to graduation and have some Navajo tacos at somebody's graduation party, it's not the end of the world. Like we can have balance through the rest of our day. And so being okay with that. So I do also want to bring up some work of Tierra Madre, which is, she's a professor, native professor, where she came up with this model called the four domains of indigenous nourishment. This was just published last year and I saw it and I was like, this is what I've been looking for. Because for the most part, I was just going off of vibes. And now I'm like, yes, I have a journal article. And where she says, indigenous nourishment involves physical. It does involve spiritual, emotional, and relational. And so if you can see like in each domain, there's different areas we can achieve that with our nutrition interventions. And so physical, we're looking at land-based activities, respecting the land, practice of food knowledge, historical, traditional food knowledge, plants and animals, how is that connected to physical nourishment? Spiritual, we're looking at original instructions, maybe looking at creation stories and how indigenous foods have that creation story behind it. So for instance, like turkey for Navajos. What's the creation or the story behind turkey? So Turkey was kind of responsible. What he did back in the day was he collected seeds and his feathers when they were trying to transition to the fourth world, and that's part of the story that he had. So thinking about some of those connections, teaching, ceremony, emotional, looking at empowerment, love, gratitude, joy. How do we integrate that into our interventions, and then finally relational. How do we connect with others? How do we facilitate community food practices? How do we facilitate how we identify relatives? So, some of the speakers had identified themselves through their clans, like I did. And so that's something when I go do cooking classes, that's something I like to do as well, is to have people talk about their clans in addition to their favorite foods. And so my question always is like, how do we weave these concepts into our nutrition education? Historically, people think, oh, nutrition education's just about quote unquote portion sizes, right? 1 cup of rice and half a cup of vegetables, half a cup of fruits. And they think that's the extent of nutrition education, and it's not. We need to think about more creative ways to incorporate how do we include balance? How do we include variety of nutrition, these nutritious foods, these nourishing foods? And think about nourishing foods, not just in terms of their physical nutrition, but their emotional nourishment. And so this picture is actually, sometimes I help out Zach and Mary from Bitty Baby Foods with harvesting and with planting. So this is just a picture of us digging out some of our steamed corn. All right, so when I talk about nutrition interventions, we all, as dietitians, we all know what a 24-hour recall is, right? And when I learned 24-hour recall back in the day, it was very it felt like an interrogation. Like they're setting you up to interrogate people, like how many, what was the measurement of the rice or the blue corn mush that you had yesterday? And like, that really turns people off when you like just go straight into a 24-hour recall. So before you like gather, information about what people ate, do a little bit of warm up first, talk about, what they're interested in before you like go straight into like, what are you eating? Because dietitians for the most part are, our persona, our stereotype is, we're gonna get mad at you for eating foods, and everybody's coming in. A lot of people come in with defenses up, thinking this person's going to take away all of my foods, including my traditional indigenous foods. So I'm going to hide that from them. And we can't really make progress if they're hiding those things from us. So for me, building trust is the most important thing before we get into a 24-hour recall. But I did want to show you an example of a 24-hour recall that I would often get. I wouldn't call it a 24-hour recall. I'd be like, hey, what'd you have to eat yesterday? Just kind of like being a little bit more cash about it and not being like, tell me about your serving of oatmeal yesterday. What did you put on top of it? And that was actually my first interaction with a dietitian. I was actually referred to a dietitian when I was like 10 years old, and on the res, on the Navajo Nation. And this person was like, how many teaspoons of jam did you have on your toast yesterday? And I'm like, I'm a 10-year-old lady. Like, I don't know. What's a teaspoon? That was my first interaction with a dietitian. And I was like, I never want to go back to that lady ever again. And until, I met other dietitians who were like, hey, things are evolving now. So 24-hour recall. So for breakfast, usually people have like blue corn mush or some kind of hot cereal like cream of wheat, fried eggs, spam, tortilla for like my Navajo patients. Lunch would be like a bologna, American cheese, chips, Coke. And then dinner would be like mutton stew, fry bread, maybe punch, maybe a soda. And then snacks maybe would be like melons, bananas, cottage cheese, chips, crackers. That sounds pretty familiar, right? That sounds like what many of us had grown up with. So I don't go in and say like, what are you doing eating that American cheese? What are you doing eating that bologna? Because honestly, a lot of this food reflects their access to resources, right? Bologna stays longer in the fridge. American cheese stays longer in the fridge. They're cheaper. And it's just a reality of our current situation. So what I like to do is say, totally fine. Like we all eat like that sometimes. But what can we add in to give you a little bit more nutrition? I'm not going in there and saying like we got to stop eating all of this. I'm just saying like what are some areas we can throw in an apple, an orange, some fruit cocktail, maybe some dried fruits like apricot. Maybe we can have some dried fruits with that sandwich. Maybe for your blue corn mush, we can throw some uh, hard boiled egg in with it, things like that, where it's just giving ideas instead of just being like, stop eating all of that, because it's not really helpful to just be like, don't eat any of that. And that's what patients are used to hearing, right? They usually come to me and be like, well, my doctor told me to stop eating all these different foods, especially when they get diagnosed with diabetes, stop eating white foods, white bread, white bananas. When you say don't eat white foods to people in Native communities, it means something else. So probably let's not recommend nutrition based on the color of foods, because it may mean something differently for us. And so those are things we need to be aware of. Is like, are we actually empowering patients by giving them a list of all the foods they can't eat? Doesn't feel very empowering, because then they think everything is off limits because they're given all these no foods. So, all right. So I also like to talk about counseling techniques as nourishment. Again, we're going to get more into this, but this is just a primer. I highly recommend anybody who is working with Indigenous populations to look into trauma-informed care. And especially trauma-informed care, tailored for nutrition education. Look into motivational interviewing, definitely a skill that's really important to highlight patient autonomy. And then mindful eating. Sometimes it's called intuitive eating, sometimes it's called mindful, but these are just some of the techniques that I use when I'm counseling. So goals, how are we on time? Are we almost there? Okay. Okay, so let's let's do the polling question. Quick question. Which of the following reflects 4 key domains of nourishment in Indigenous communities? Okay, so pull up. So answers are A, emotional, financial, occupational, relational; B, nutritional, cultural, political, social; C is physical, environmental, economic, spiritual; and then D is physical, spiritual, emotional, and relational. So let's see if we can get a few people. All right, so I will tell you the answer since we need to get going. It is D, physical, spiritual, emotional, and relational. Those are the 4 key domains of nourishment. All right, so just keep in mind, different bodies have different needs, all the way from infancy to elder care. For babies, we want to make sure, we're introducing appropriate foods, looking at appetite, any medications or surgeries, blood pressure, families' cultural beliefs, especially around food. And then number of dirty and wet diapers, and then who are the primary caregivers. For some Native families, it's going to be like elders are the primary caregivers. So sometimes when you're working with Native communities, the parent may bring in the child, but they may not be the primary caregiver. It may be the mom or the dad. So just keeping that in mind. With pregnancy, specifically, we want to, keep an ear out for disordered eating patterns, just looking at different nutrients that are highlighted in pregnancy, like calcium, and omega-3s and folate, folic acid, thinking about gastrointestinal complaints and then the history of fasting and dieting, and then pica, alcohol, drug use, also looking at their physical activity levels, again, cultural beliefs around food, hydration status, health literacy, and language spoken and literacy. Older adults, I think this is relevant for everybody, access to food. Just thinking about what is their food security situation, appetite changes, dentition, difficulty in chewing or swallowing, and then their hydration status, and then also their ability to perform ADLs. Can they cook for themselves? And then also just for Native communities, especially specifically, if they have access to running water, clean, safe water, and electricity or a fridge. Some people don't have fridges or freezers. So when to refer to a dietitian. So for all the non-dietitian folks, just keep in mind, you don't have to have all the answers for nutrition. That's why dietitians are here, to fill that in. And definitely a whole conversation about, the process of referring and billing and all that stuff. But just keep in mind, if somebody's like, has these conditions, they have special medical conditions, positive for malnutrition screening. If you're not doing malnutrition screening at your hospital, please do it. Very important, very much overlooked in Native communities. There is no evidence right now, research on the level of malnutrition in Native communities, and I think that's especially important, especially since we have diabetes, like that can cause somebody go into DKA, liver disease. Please do malnutrition screenings. We're at higher risk for cancer, which can lead to malnutrition. Complex dietary needs, multiple food-related health conditions, and then the person's super engaged in their condition, like they just have a lot of questions. So last thing, or let's just skip this one actually, so we can get into Q&A. So time for a break. Any questions?
Hi, we'll bring microphones around for folks to help who have Oh,
I'm gonna grab some.
okay. I obviously can't talk, turn on a microphone, and walk at the same time.
I had a quick question. When you say malnutrition screening, what does that kind of look like as far as like for an individual? And then
So-
also, if we are doing like our own personal annual screening, is there anything you would recommend as far as going through the whole complex of just like screening health-wise?
Yeah, so I used to work for a hospital based on the res, and that was one of my initiatives or campaigns is trying to screen for malnutrition, especially on the inpatient side. We had about 20 beds at that facility. And during the pandemic was when we really started to understand like, malnourishment affects, outcomes. And so the malnutrition screening, there's several different ones. But the more common screening that is it 3 questions, the MUST screening tool. So if you just Google MUST screening tool, and if you want to talk more about it, I actually developed like a algorithm and a worksheet for malnutrition, doing malnutrition screenings in the hospital. We did it for inpatient. By the end of the whole initiative, we ended up screening 100% of patients who were admitted for treatment for ICU, MSU. And so we got the nurses on board, and definitely being friends with the nurse really helped us get this whole screening initiative in place. So when we screen for malnutrition, we're looking at, the level of weight they might have lost within the past month, within the past 3 months, past 6 months. We have like certain parameters, and then also their muscle strength. We also look at, some physical indicators of malnutrition, like, hollowed eyes or the temporal regions where it's hollowed out. And so with dietitians, they can also do something called an NFPE, nutrition focused physical exam, a little bit more labor intensive, but if you really want to get into it, then that's something we can, hospitals can look into as well. But definitely doing a screening using the MUST screening tool. I know that there's ones tailored for like elders. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But be friends with your nurses. That's what I took out of it.
We are using the microphone so Zoom participants can hear. So
Danae, would you speak more to how, what's your view or more information about how you see food as resiliency?
You know, so food as resiliency, in our history, something like fry bread, right? There's very much differing views. Many Native people have different views on it. But resiliency, fry bread was born out of a history of pretty much forced relocation, concentration camps. And we were provided with flour, water, some kind of fat, oil, salt. And so our communities really kind of figured out a way to, survive. And so fry bread can be a story of resiliency for some people. And so it's kind of showing like, hey, we did what we had to live. And many of the food knowledge that we have today survived genocide. It survived forced relocation. And so that is a testament to resiliency. We're still here. We're still practicing some of these food knowledge, food ways. And that's a major point of cultural pride. So again, you have 100 different natives in the room, ask them about fry bread, there's 100 different views. And for me, I'm just like, I want to respect whatever view you have. Cool, that's fine. I'm not here to say like, you need to stop eating that, because who am I? I don't know their situation. I don't know if fry bread is the only thing they can eat. What if that is the case? So am I going to shame them for eating it if that's the only thing they can eat? No. And so that's, some of the resiliency comes from that, is like, we survived and we're proud of it.
we are going to go to a couple of Zoom questions.
All right, so the first question we have is, how do you work with patients who traditionally don't cook for themselves but need to make changes in their diet?
I find out who is cooking. I remember a patient, somebody who didn't cook at all. She just hated it. She lived next door to her parents, and she didn't even have a fridge. She had like a little camping stove in her little house, and that was the extent of it. So, we talked it through and saw like, okay, how do you get your food? And again, looking at the additive approach and thinking like, okay, let's meet you where you're at. How do you get your food right now? Do you go to your parents' house, pick up some food there? Most of the time, this person was going to like Blake's and getting a breakfast burrito, getting hamburgers at lunchtime. And I say, okay, what can we order at Blake's that gives you more nutrition? Or how can we add into that? Maybe they just really hate cooking and that's totally fine. Let's figure out a way to work around it to add more nutrition. I'm not going to tell you to start making all your meals from scratch, because that is just not sustainable, right? She's going to hate it. And so maybe there is going to be a point where she does want to learn some basic skills, basic kitchen skills, knife skills, storage, things to keep in mind, but maybe we're not there yet. So that's where, again, building that trust between the patient and just being like, okay, this is what you have access to. This is what you do now. How can we add to that? Instead of just me saying like, stop it. So.
And we have time for one more question, and we'll go to Zoom for that last question. We don't have, oh, well then we'll go live here. Does anybody else have a question? All right.
Within the Native community, do you find, how can I word this? Do you find that there's more clients with gestational diabetes or even low iron care, I guess? I don't know how to pronounce, like.
Like
and-
I've like the level of iron deficiency in GDM patients.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of them, and that's where definitely understanding resources like WIC, how do they get access to WIC? Because they're gonna offer more iron fortified foods in there, and they're gonna offer that supplemental nutrition assistance. And so iron deficiency, yeah, that's something we need to be aware of. We need to talk to our patients about getting checked for that. The deficiency could be related to a different micronutrient deficiency like folate or B12. And so we have to kind of get, see that lab work first. And then also with like native communities, they're very much used to cooking, or historically they've been a little bit more used to cooking in like cast iron. And so, we cook fry bread in cast iron just because it holds heat a little bit better. So you could be like, hey, you can cook your food not just for fry bread, you can cook it in a cast iron. So then that way we can incorporate more iron in there too. So, and again, it just depends on, their lab work. That's what's really going to tell us. But yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of people iron deficient. They had GDM. Some of them were very hesitant about, taking their iron pills because they have a lot of like GI issues with it or constipation, or it just makes them like it gives them heartburn. And so that's where we can say like, okay, if you're very adamant about not taking iron, let's see how we can like get some of these iron rich foods in there. It really is hard to overcome an iron deficiency with food alone, but just giving them those options too about like, okay, if you're very adamant about not taking it, then let's see that. Otherwise, we do have to start discussing transfusion because like iron is important. Oxygen is important for your baby. Yeah. All right.
All right, well, that'll conclude this session. We're going to